Welcome to the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication at Rice University. In this workshop, Scott Walters is going to discuss the creation of test specifications. Please download and open the file provided. You will be asked to follow along at certain points in the workshop. Let's listen to him introduce the topic.
What I want to offer you today are some thoughts and ideas about how you might later put together assessments for your classes. But what's a spec? What is the spec? It's a specification. It's short for specification, A+. And that's sort of, yes, you can go. You can go now that you're done. Yes. A specification, what is a specification? It's a kind of, it's a recipe, okay. Right, it's a kind of blueprint or recipe to help teachers design assessment tasks, right? Okay, and it's to design, it helps people design a parallel task, which is probably a term I did not put in that sheet. A parallel task is a task which has the same test format and it tests the same skill, but the content is different, okay? It can be for a test. We can make a specification for a whole test, or it can be for a test item. Item is roughly synonymous with task. We don't have to bother with the differences between the two today.
Now that Scott has defined a spec, let's listen as he talks about why we use specs.
What's the rationale for specs? What did I say in my little mini essay? It can help people achieve consensus on what exactly? You're correct, but on what?
On the validity.
Consensus on the validity, right?
Criteria?
You could make consent, on criteria, that's a good one too. That's a good application of the idea. It'll keep you clear on what the skills are, right? Very often we might make a test 1 year and we give it to our students and we think we've defined the skills a certain way. But then next year rolls around, maybe our thinking has shifted and so we make another test and maybe the two tests from year to year shift. Now sometimes that's a good thing because our understanding evolves, but maybe it's a bad thing because our measurement is not consistent, okay? So it can help us keep us clear, and it can also, as the lady said, help groups of teachers to achieve consensus on what the skills are, first of all, and what kind of test methods, which is the how, would be best used to assess them. Okay. And also to maintain test security, right? You don't want your test ending up on eBay, right? That would be uncool, right? And as the gentleman mentioned, it can help us maintain validity in our inferences from the test results. So specs can be very useful for all these reasons.
And finally, who uses specs?
Who reads a spec anyway? So you go to all the trouble and you make a spec. Okay, big deal. Who are you gonna send it to your grandmother? Who's gonna read this thing? Other instructors, oneself, maybe Raphael, okay? APs, assistant principals if you're in the school system, right? Item writers if you work for a testing company, right? And test takers sometimes, not often. But this is your audience. When you're crafting your specs, these are the kinds of audiences that you typically would have in mind. There are many different kinds of specification models. The kind that I would like us to work with today was devised by two scholars, Fred Davidson and Brian Lynch, after somebody named Popham, who was a mainstream ed measurement guy back in the 70s. And so there are certain components to this model which I think are very useful for us pedagogically to kind of figure out, to get our minds around how to make a decent spec.
Now, turn to page 3 of the document called Spec's Handout. Let's break down the spec with Scott.
We have, for example, a title, author. We got information at the top, kind of the header, right? We have something called a general description, right? Or a GD for short. A general description is a summary of the whole spec document. It's kind of an introduction, okay? Now remember, who's the audience? The audience maybe is yourself or another teacher who goes into a database 5 years from now and says, this is a nice spec. I'm going to see if I can use this. So you're addressing that person. And a GD is a good place to get that sort of temporal conversation going. Hello. There's also a component which is not explicitly listed here, which is called the mandate, which is kind of the why of the test. You can think of a mandate as something representing social forces that are behind a test, right? In the state of Texas, do you have a state achievement test for high school people? What's it called?
STAR.
The STAR. Okay. Okay. Where did that test come from? Why was that test made?
To keep the schools accountable for the students.
Just to keep the schools accountable. So there were people involved in creating that thing. There were like state legislators, right? There were maybe parents that were concerned about their kids. There were maybe, sorry?
The Board of Education in Texas.
The Board of Ed of Texas was behind it. Maybe also a testing company got involved a little bit, right? We had that in Illinois too.
Maybe sometimes they bring teachers.
And and hopefully, God willing, they will bring teachers in to make the thing. So there are a lot of social forces that go behind the creation of every test. Now for us, for you guys here in Click, in our classrooms, the social forces is like you and your students, and you have sort of you have pedagogical purposes, right? I have to assess these guys in French or Chinese or whatever, okay? And so that's sort of my mandate. So that's kind of a long discussion about mandate. There's also a component called the prompt attributes section, or the PA, which is ideally a detailed description of what the test taker sees or hears on the test. Maybe it's a piece of paper with 10 questions. Maybe it's some sort of interview situation, one-on-one. It describes what the test taker encounters. And that's the PA, right? So if there's a prompt attributes, there ideally is something correspondingly called the response attributes, right? Which would be what? If this one's what the test taker sees and hears, this one would be?
What he does. What he does.
Right. Perfect. It's a description of what the test taker is expected to do, what we hope the test taker will do. Okay, so PARA, right? And if you look further, there's also something called sample items, which are examples of potential tasks on your test that you're going to cook from the recipe, right? I like that idea of cooking test questions. I think of baking, I don't know. And then there's another section here which is called the specification supplement. This is like just a catch-all section where it contains things that don't fit in the other sections. It's kind of like your attic or maybe the trunk of your car. We just throw things in there that are useful but don't fit elsewhere. Okay, so this is basically the model that we're going to look at and work with today to start thinking about, well, how can I use a spec? How can I make a spec, and how can I use a spec to make a test?
Scott introduced the following components of a spec. Now that we are familiar with the different parts of a spec, let's look at some examples.
Let's critically examine some specs. You've got some in front of you.
Please turn to page 4 in the document named Specs Handout. Take a few minutes to look over this example spec. What do you like or dislike about this spec? Would you be able to use it in your classes? Pause the video here while you think about this.
Is the spec language clear? No. Yes. Is it clear all the time? Maybe that's a better question. Are there some parts clear or some parts unclear? Could you create parallel test tasks from it? Also, you might beg that question. Would you want to? No. Oh, okay. Sorry. And all right. So, what are some plaints?
So the first reaction was that it was a bit too ambitious, and so.
In what way too ambitious?
And too many things they're trying to measure, or seem to be trying to measure language, knowledge, logic, reasoning, discrete words, structures, idioms. There's like a laundry list of things that they're trying to do.
So it's a bit too ambitious. Would you all agree? Is it too full a laundry basket? Or laundry list?
We don't know if the student's not right. We don't know exactly what we can infer from that wrong answer. If the student doesn't know the language, or if the student's not good with logic.
Yeah, we
or if
don't
the
quite
student-
know who the students are.
So the validity of the test is not very good because we don't know what we can infer from the result of the test.
Yeah, the validity, although, just so I can tweak it, it's not a validity of the task, it's the validity of the
Yeah, the validity
Of the-
inferences.
inference, right? It's the validity. So if we look at the spec language here and we look at the sample items here, like, can we infer all the skills and knowledge that the lady had said? Can we infer all that from this? Probably not.
As you probably noticed, there are many issues with this spec. It may be too ambitious, and as Scott mentioned, it may be possible to break down the spec into as many as 5 different specs instead of just one. How many specs do you think you could create with the content of this one? Now let's listen as Scott discusses the sample items from the spec.
What did you think of the sample items, the good and bad part? Was that enlightening? There are 2 correct answers for every question. Not good craftsmanship. Remember, one of the reasons for a spec is so that you guys can achieve a consensus on what the skill or skills are. How do you articulate it? You know, how do you conceptualize it? Theoretically, practically, whatever. Okay, so that's actually a very good observation. If we can clear things up at the spec stage, then hopefully we won't have problems when we actually make a test. Now, of course, when we're starting a new test, it's like, you know, a new exploration, right? You can write what you think is a very good spec, and then you can start a test and then you pilot the test, right? You try it out. But then you get results that are pretty whack sometimes, and so you can use the results from the first giving of the test to then come back and say, okay, are we able to infer the skills correctly? Have we made a mistake in making the items, or have we made a mistake at the spec level? Right, so this helps us have that discussion when we want to maybe improve our test.
Now turn to page 6 in the document named Spec's Handout. What do you like or dislike about this spec? Again, please pause the video while you take a moment to critique this example spec. What did you think? Let's listen to the discussion.
All right, what do you think of this one? Very different spec from the other one, right? No Groucho, no logic, no reasoning, right? What do you think of this one? Any sense? You were mentioning there was something maybe missing, or?
Well, we were saying that there's several things missing. It doesn't tell us details of how the activity is going to be conducted, how many students are going to be involved in each one, the logistics.
Yeah, is it in a classroom? I mean, is there an actual telephone involved? Is it a recording? Or is it like 2 people, you can have like 2 students sitting back to back so they don't see each other and you can simulate a phone conversation that way, right? So that's unclear. So that part of the PA needs some fleshing out.
We also talked about the missing rubric.
What rubric? Oh, the missing rubric.
They mentioned a rubric at the end.
It's the response action.
It doesn't tell us what exact.
Yeah, it just refers to a rubric in the second bullet or the second line of the RA, but it's absent, right?
And I don't think the RA is specific enough. When you say correct use of grammar points covered in class, if I want to use this spike, I would be a little bit confused. What exactly are you expecting students to accomplish in this conversation?
It's not specific enough.
It's not.
Yeah, if this is supposed to be tied to a certain curriculum of instruction, it's a bit vague.
It would have been difficult.
And perhaps, where do you think information about, say, the point of the curriculum or the part of the point of the syllabus Where do you think that could go? What component could contain that information, do you think, in this spec? Probably not the PA, right? You wouldn't talk about the curriculum in the PA necessarily, would you?
It's a general description.
Maybe in the GD, right? Or possibly in the SS. Maybe even in the title. You could say task for midterm exam for
Chapters 5.
chapter blah blah, right? So that sort of information is missing. What else? What else is?
The note-taking skill. It's not clear to me when exactly that note-taking actually occurs in the activity. It's supposed
Yeah, there's nothing in the RA about the note taking
Who's
at
the
all.
pizza guy?
We don't know.
Because the students are supposed to order pizza, not to take the.
Yeah, so we don't know if there are two students
Two students
involved
and-
and one
right.
who's like
But
plays
it's
one
not clear.
role and the other one plays the other role.
This is
Or if they have,
authentic conversation, right?
so they really
Yeah,
call.
So I'm just wondering if they're supposed to.
So they're really calling a
It's not
pizza
clear.
place
That's right.
and having the pizza delivered somewhere else? Because it says it's supposed to be delivered.
Right.
No, it's supposed to be delivered somewhere else where they are not. They're going to.
So the task will be the successful ordering of a pizza for delivery. So there's nothing about taking notes, nothing about,
Right.
yeah, it's ordering of a pizza.
So
that means.
pizza, you get 100.
If not, yeah.
So maybe that's irrelevant. We could get rid of it.
Yeah.
Maybe get rid of it, unless the person is the pizza parlor person,
Right.
who would have to take notes about what kind of pizza, how many toppings, what's the address, how to get their blood.
Right.
So maybe, but it's not spelled out.
It's not spelled.
Yeah. So that's flawed in another way. Okay. Good.
And also
You have sort of a
the-
frown on your face. Do you have anything to say? You just don't look well. Do you want some pizza? Okay. Mom, you had a thing?
Yeah, I'm thinking, suppose this is a speaking test. We want to give to, say, second semester students every semester, okay? And the ordering pizza should be just one example. The speaking test can be ordering pizza to buy ice cream or whatever, right? And then your spec should give the general ideas. Whatever this kind of speaking text you want to give, no matter it's order pizza or going to buy something, could all apply to that.
This you're elaborating on your comment earlier. Like Mom pointed out that, for example, the GD talks about ordering a pizza. However, the language of the PA, does that talk about pizzas?
No,
It's a bit more.
very broad.
It's very broad.
Yeah.
All right, you remember the mini essay thing I sent you? And there was this notion of, right, generativity, which means what? Pardon my bad penmanship. What is,
Creating different tests.
huh?
Can be generated.
What can be generated?
An item.
An item or a task from, right, the spec. The teacher can use the spec recipe to generate cupcake items, okay? I didn't mean anything by that. Okay, so in order to do that, in order to be generative, your language has to be, it's kind of a fine thing, right? Your language has to occupy a certain level of specificity or, whoop, I flunked the writing test. Or level of generality. The more specific you are, the harder it is to be generative. Because then it's not a generative spec, it's just a set of instructions, right? You follow that? So you can't be too specific about it. So maybe the language in the GD here is a bit right? But if you're too general, then maybe you can't generate much of value. So it's always a struggle, which is why specs are crafted in groups. So you can sort of pool your experience and your knowledge of the curriculum, the syllabus, the goals of the program, and so on, the goals of your course, your knowledge of the language, et cetera, et cetera. You can pool that, and hopefully by revising the spec a number of times, which you will do, you can just hit the right level of specificity and generality. This example is sort of an intentional joke. I did it on purpose, of course, not to mess with your mind, but to sort of help you, like you raised the issue yourselves, right? So you can kind of see what needs to be done there.
Now that you have critiqued 2 specs, turn to page 7 in the document. This example spec is much longer and includes all of the areas that Scott recommends. Take a moment to look over the spec and all of its component parts.
Is this a little bit different from the first 2 specs we looked at? Totally, okay. So I just want to suggest to you that this model, this spec model with GDs, PAs, and RAs is actually kind of elastic. You can adapt it to your needs. Okay, and so when you start to create your own specs, maybe you'll have a longer GD or a shorter SS or whatever. Okay, I don't want you to sort of be ruled by one single example.
Now it's time to create your own spec. Scott will introduce the task, and then we will transition to the wrap-up of the workshop.
Some form of the Davidson-Lynch spec model. You've got 3 or 4 examples of specs in front of you, so some form of it. Craft a spec. I want you to do that today with your colleagues at your table. To get you started, first you need to decide on the setting, the learners, the institution. Well, the institution, it's Rice University, Clegg, that part's easy, right? Okay, who the learners are, what the class is, what's the test setting, what's the assessment mandate, why you want to create this thing. Okay, I want you to think of an actual situation. I know you all teach different courses. You're going to have to choose one from among you. Choose one setting, figure out I know this sort of, I want to do my spec. No, I want to do my spec. But just choose one, choose a mandate, choose a skill or skills of interest, okay, that you would teach and want to assess in your courses. Get to writing your PA, it might be helpful to start with this phrasing. The student will see or hear whatever. And then for the RA, you might put, what do you think? The student will plus verb, right? Okay. That's kind of a succinct way of just doing it. Thank you. Nice meeting you and working with you.
Thank you for watching and participating in the workshop held by Scott Walters and the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication at Rice University.